One day, the circus came to the shtetl. This was the shtetl of Rav Chaim Krasner, a disciple of the holy Baal Shem Tov, who we discussed in our last session. It was a group of gymnasts, a juggler, gymnasts, and in particular a tightrope walker, who had a large rope that he stretched between two very, very sturdy tree trunks on either side of a river. Well, maybe it wasn't a large river, perhaps it was a stream, a deep gorge, and at the bottom of the gorge, not only water, but sharp rocks. He stretched the rope as tightly as he could with his assistants, and he began walking the tightrope. He was dancing on the rope. Rav Chaim Krasner, the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, came by and started watching intently. The Hasidim noticed that he was spending more time than they expected. He seemed to be deeply absorbed in the performance, as if he was watching a sacred event, a divine rite somehow. And they saw in his eyes that he was reaching the stage of hitpashtus agashmius, what is called divestment of corporeality, as if he was in the synagogue, perhaps on Yom Kippur, at Kol Nidre or even at Nila. It was a very high experience that he was having. And the Hasidim began to wonder, what on earth was captivating the rabbi so much? Okay, it was an interesting performance, but why this level of deep religious intensity? And he says to them, the Rav answered, I was pondering, I was meditating. Why is this person risking his life? Let's say that for the performance, he'll win or he'll receive a few silver coins. However, if he's thinking of the coins that he's going to receive, he will fall in the river for sure. The only thing that he needs to be thinking about is keeping his balance and activating all of his training and all of his experience. Not leaning to one side, not leaning to the other side too much, but staying on balance. Any other thoughts would bring disaster. But if he's not thinking of what he's going to earn, then why is he doing it? Why is he risking his life? And that's the end of the Hasidic story as it appears in a collection called Tiferes HaYehudi, Warsaw, 1912. Why was he so captivated? And why did the Hasidim tell this story? I suggest that one of the points of the story is that only by disregarding goals and benefits and designs and plans can the walker keep his balance. Perhaps he had set up a hat, as buskers often do, on one side of the river, hoping that people would throw in their coins. But if he would be glancing at the hat during the performance, he would certainly lose his balance and fall into the river. He could not allow himself to be distracted by thoughts of his family and maybe rent to pay and food to put on the table and wood to chop and the coming winter. None of that. All of the long-term goals had to be totally out of his mind as he was focused on only one thing, his presence, his being, his keeping his balance. It's not only the tightrope walker who was experiencing total presence, but the rabbi was saying that even watching another in the spiritual practice of being totally present itself channels that presence and that dimension of existence. With the intensity of his gaze on the tightrope dancer, the rabbi, Rav Chaim Krasner, entered the fusion of mind and body that enabled the successful traversal of the rope. So therefore, the Hasidic story opens an aperture of successive observational frames. The rabbi is looking at the delicate balance of the performer. The students are learning from the rabbi. The Hasidim are learning from the rabbi. The narrator who's telling the story to us. And finally, we, the auditors or the readers, entering the world of the tale, and through the magic of narrative, of storytelling, beginning to understand what is possible when one leaves the world of distraction and focuses on the world of total presence. This is an example of what we discussed last time. The Baal Shem Tov and embodiment, the Baal Shem Tov and being present in the world, the Baal Shem Tov and seeing the divine in the seemingly mundane. One of the interpretations that I love from the Baal Shem Tov is based on a verse in Kohelet, Ecclesiastes 9:10. Kohelet again, Kol asher timtza yadcha lasot bekochacha aseh. Whatever your hand turns to do it with all your strength. The Baal Shem Tov understands the koach to be do it with all your power, do it with all your inner power, do it with all your mindfulness, do it with all your awareness, do it with all your focus, do it with all your total attentiveness. So the verse in Kohelet is not just an adjuration to seize the day, but it is a calling to be totally where you are. Whatever you're doing, if it's worth doing at all, it's worth doing with your total attentiveness and your total presence. I begin with that tale, first of all, because I wanted to make the transition from our previous session where we talked about the Baal Shem Tov, where we talked about B'chol derachecha da'eyu v'hu yiyasher orchotecha. That amazing verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, which again the Baal Shem Tov highlights. You see how so much of Baal Shem Tov teaching, of Hasidic teaching, is based around a reframing of a verse. B'chol derachecha da'eyu, in all your ways you can know God, and God will make your path straight. God will bring balance and equipoise to your path, just like the tightrope walker. And the Hasidic tale not only tells that story, but invites us to enter into that story. So now let's do a little background on the significance and the power of Hasidic tales and why tales and stories are so central in the world of Hasidut. I think of the Hasidic tale as a kind of a Rebbe. Is to say, a Rebbe is someone who guides, who points, who doesn't force, doesn't compel, ever. Someone who compels, demands, is not a Rebbe. A Rebbe opens possibilities and allows us to see possibilities that we have not necessarily seen before. And one of the reasons why I love that story is that it's possible to be at a nominally secular event and to gain deep religious significance and come out with enormous spiritual message from the ostensibly secular event. So the tale is a Rebbe, a teacher or guide, gently challenging us to greater insight. Tales assist in cultivating an inner voice. That's one of the goals of Hasidism. You want to have an inner voice because we're constantly challenged every moment of our lives. What is the best way to proceed? What does wisdom want from us? What are we challenged to do at this moment? When we reach a situation that is similar to that of the tale in some respect, we may be reminded of the tale, which may then provide perspective and discernment. The tales in the world of Hasidism are often aphoristic, hinging on a play on words or a pun. And we'll see some of this in just a few moments. The tales may pivot around a new understanding or interpretation of a verse of Scripture, as we've just said, or a Talmudic passage. Yes, the values. Faith in God, to be sure. Faith in the tzaddik, in the community, in the power of prayer. Inwardness, devotion, simplicity. The importance of seeing things from another perspective. That invariably means seeing things from the side of the powerless, the disenfranchised, those who otherwise would not have a voice. And as we noticed with the tale that I began with, the tale of Rav Chaim Krasner and the rope walker, by telling the tale, we are invited to empower ourselves with the message, with the world, with the atmosphere of the tale itself. So telling a Hasidic tale is a performative action. As Martin Buber, one of the great transmitters of Hasidic tales, put it, it affects its own redemptive moment. To tell a tale about healing is healing. To tell a tale about reconciliation effects reconciliation. To tell a tale about enlightenment gives the teller and the listeners a window into the possibility of being enlightened. Well, excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam sha'kol nihiyah bidvaro. A story from the world of the Ropshitzer Rebbe, Reb Naftali of Ropshitz, and his son, who is known as the Jikover Rebbe, Rebbe Eliezer of Jikov, died 1860, and the disciple of Rav Naftali of Ropshitz, the great Rav Chaim of Sons, Rav Chaim Sanzer. The story is told that the son of the Ropshitzer, the Jikover, was very, very sick. The doctors gave up hope, and the Sanzer Rav, who was the disciple in the circle, came to visit the Jikover and hopefully to pray for him, to do what a Hasidic Rebbe could do in terms of intercession. And surprisingly, the conversation went like this, as reported in the tale. The Sanzer, the disciple, goes to the Jikover, who's in his sickbed, and says, "Why do you want to live?" And the Jikover is perhaps surprised by the question. Well, we all want to live. Why do you want to live? And the Sanzer goes on with the question. You know, we both believe in the world to come. Yes, of course, Olam Haba. Why are you afraid to die? You'll go up there, you'll be in heaven, you'll sit next to all the great Hasidic masters, especially the Choza of Lublin, the legendary seer, the clairvoyant, the seer of Lublin. Your father, the Ropshitzer. In fact, you'll be able to converse with the holy Baal Shem Tov. I believe you're going to go straight to heaven. What's the problem? What do you have here that you don't have there? The Jikover looks and says, well, I have a wedding of grandchildren that's coming up. I want to be at the wedding of my grandchildren. And the Sanzer, the disciple, says, don't worry about that. I'll be at the chasana too. I'll be at the wedding. I'll walk your grandchildren down to the chuppah. The Jikover says, wait a minute. All right. You may not know this, but I'm the head of a very important charity fund. We help people here, and in particular, we help people in the land of Israel. We support hundreds, maybe thousands of orphans and widows, poor Talmidei Chachamim, poor Talmud scholars. I am the head of this charity fund. And the Sanzer says, no problem. I'll take over responsibility for the fund. The Jikover says, There he is lying in his sickbed, perhaps coughing, sweating, high fever. He says, I promised I would finish Shas by a certain day. This is my third time through the entire Shas. I want to make a siyum on Shas. Sandra says, no worries, I'll finish Shas for you. Whatever the Jikover said, the Sanzer said, I'll take care of it. And he kept on asking the question, why do you want to live? And finally the Jikover said, he gathered his strength, sat up in his sickbed, and said very forcefully, I am a Baal Tefillah. I lead davening, especially on Yomim Noroyim. And when I get up in front of the Omid, when I am the Baal Tefillah on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, thousands of angels, I see them. Thousands of angels come to join with me and to say the Kedusha. I want to lead the davening one more time. And the Sanzer says, that's what I was waiting for. And in the language of the Gemara, Yahiv Yodei Ve'ukmei, he took the Sanzer, who was well, took the hands of the Jikover and said, I give you the strength to rise up. And then the fever broke, and the Jikover got better. So, the way I heard this story, the way I understand this story is, the Sanzer was not being provocative. The Sanzer was challenging the Jikover, the sick person, to come to the core of his being. There are many things that we think we want to do. There are many projects that we would like to accomplish. They could be done by others, perhaps. But there may be one thing in my life that I know that only I can do. That's the core of my will. That's the core of my desire. That's the core of what makes me a human being. That's what bonds me to other people, to my past, to my future, and to God. And that is the real modus vivendi. And the Sanzer challenged the Jikover to come to that nukudah pneimit, to that inner point. Once he had reached it, once he knew what he really wanted to live for, then he found the strength to be able to marshal his energies and to go on and to live and to fully recover. Some say that that is the meaning of Tu B'Shvat. This can really be taken as a Tu B'Shvat story, because the trees, many of the trees, are as good as dead in the winter. At least they look like they're dead. This may not happen here in the milder climate. Baruch Hashem, we are blessed in Eretz Yisrael. But I also spend a lot of time in America, in New England, New Hampshire, Vermont. Unless the trees are evergreens, they really, really look like they're dead. And something happens around this time. It's actually known as sap time. And something internal where the sap begins to flow. It may not be visible from the outside, but internally, the tree is already beginning to prepare for the spring, because the tree realizes that the days are beginning to get longer. And the trees, so to speak, are beginning to yearn for the fruit that is to come. There's something that is inside of us that yearns always for the fruit that is yet to come. When we discover what that is, we find the energy to rise up, to be strong, to be courageous, and to not only continue with our lives, but to flourish and to prevail. A similar story, but with another nusach, with another mode of expression, from another one of the lineages. You know, each Hasidic lineages has its own modality, has its own culture, has its own particular stamp, way of serving God. Any event, this is from Chabad. It's a famous story. And Chabad Hasidim tell this story often. It was from the time when Rav Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, was in prison. He was in St. Petersburg, what the Hasidim say, Peterburg. He was in Peterburg. And he was incarcerated under false charges by the opponents of the Hasidic movement. One of his jailers was evidently a devout Christian, as he read the Bible. And he came to the rabbi one day and he said, "Rabbi, I see that you are a genuinely pious person. You spend the whole day in prayer and in study and in reflection, and you don't complain about your conditions in the prison, unlike most of the other prisoners. I have a question for you. God, at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, asks Adam, 'Where are you?' But I thought I was told that God knows everything. Why is he asking Adam where you are? Didn't he know where Adam was?" And the rabbi looks at the jailer and says, "Well, let's say that you have a man who's 45 years old, perhaps married, perhaps with 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls." And he gives details, biographical details, just simply chosen out of the blue as an example. And the question that that person has to ask himself is, where am I? This is the question that every human being needs to ask. Where am I in my life? I've been given a gift from God, the gift of life, the gift of opportunity, the gift of whatever time I have on this earth. How far along am I? How much have I succeeded in doing? What could I have done with my time? How can I use my time better in the future? Where am I in my path on this earth? And the jailer began to tremble, because every one of the details that the rabbi seemingly picked at random just as an example out of the air was exactly describing the jailer, his age and his family situation and everything else. And the jailer began to say, "Rabbi, you have something that I would like to have." And his life was transformed. The point of the story is not the clairvoyance. At least for me, the point of the story is not the clairvoyance. Many Hasidic tales do focus on the paranormal, on the miraculous. But it's almost always the case that the miracle elements are in the service of a moral and ethical and spiritual lesson, as is the case here. Yes, maybe the rabbi saw things about the jailer that the jailer didn't even know that anybody else knew. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is teaching the meaning of that one key word, ayeka. Where are you? And indeed, when I remember that story, when I think of that story, which is often, I ask myself, where am I? So, another story of the Chose of Lublin, the seer of Lublin. He was early 19th century in Lublin, Poland, and he was famous as a genuine charismatic with the power of clairvoyance, and says, in fact, it is said that he asked God to take away the clairvoyance. It was too much for him. And eventually, it wasn't taken away entirely, but the range of operation was diminished to some degree at his request. In any event, in the world of Hasidism, he is remembered as the great seer, like the prophets of the Bible itself. So Chose means visionary, clairvoyant seer. And like the great Hasidic masters, he gave efficacious brachos, he gave efficacious blessings. That is to say, the reputation is that you go to a Rebbe, you get a blessing, and you can be secure that in some way, in some beneficial way, your request will be answered. There will be a positive improvement in your life. So the Chose of Lublin was traveling to a particular town. Perhaps he was performing a wedding. He goes in the carriage, and by the time he arrives at his destination, hundreds and hundreds of townsfolk have surrounded the town square where the coach is about to stop. Everyone wanting to get attention from the seer of Lublin as he gets off the coach and perhaps goes to the chuppah, perhaps only a few hundred feet to where the chuppah was set up. There was one family that had a serious problem. They had a child, a young girl, who was not able to walk. Of course, in those days in the shtetl, there were no orthopedic experts whatsoever. There were no orthopedic surgeons. There was nothing they could do other than pray. And they wanted the blessing of the seer of Lublin, but they realized that with the hundreds of people that would be crowding around, it would be impossible for the Rebbe to come to their house. It simply, they wouldn't be able to get his time, his attention. It simply wouldn't happen. So they set on the following strategy. The mother and the father carried the young child into the town square with all the people and set her down right on the floor, right on the ground, hoping that the Rebbe would walk their way, and eventually they would signal to the Rebbe, get his attention, and get the blessing of the Rebbe. Now, the Rebbe had an assistant. I mentioned his name earlier, but Naphtali of Ropshitz, who later became a great Rebbe himself, who inspired whole lines of further disciples and Hasidim and great Rebbeim that came from his line. But at this point, he was a youngster, maybe 18 years old at the time, and he was the Gabbai, he was the personal assistant of the seer of Lublin. He was a strong, strapling young man. You know, we often think of Rebbeim, of course we think of them in their old age. They were all young at some point. And especially in the Hasidic movement in its early years certainly was a young person's movement. All the people who were in the circle of the great Maggid of Mezrich, for example, were quite young. In fact, many of them were teenagers. So you had this teenager, what we would call a teenager, right? Not a shtetl word. It's a modern term. But he was strong, he was big. Naphtali of Ropshitz. Here's what he did. He knew that whenever the Chozeh of Lublin traveled, he would be surrounded by crowds that could actually endanger the Rebbe. So he would be the advance man. Let me make sure I have the mic here. He would be the advance man. And he would stand like this. He would move back. And he would say, Mach Platz von Rebbe. Mach Platz von Rebbe. Make place for the Rebbe. Make place for the Rebbe. Make place for the Rebbe. So this is what he does in this town. So the Rebbe gets off the coach, and it's a very large and somewhat rowdy crowd. Everybody wants to get the blessing from the Rebbe. So he stretches out his hands and he says again, Mach Platz, make room for the Rebbe, make room for the Rebbe, make room for the... Suddenly, he stumbles. He stumbles. Hu nitkal. And he looks down and he sees this child. He sees this little girl sitting on the ground. And he says to her, would you please get up? The parents begin to scream in surprise and delight. The child gets up and walks for the first time. That's the end of the story. Now let me unpack it. Here's my takeaway. Again, there may be a miraculous element to the story. If you like, you could say that the illness, as some of them are to some degree psychosomatic. Again, suggestion, placebo effect. I'm aware of all the psychological explanations. That's not my point. My point is, the way I read the story is that the blessing came, but not in the way and not from the person who the people were expecting. Is to say, you can receive blessing, you will receive blessing, but if you're fixated on one person, on one strategy, on one event, on one technique is never going to do it. You have to be open to multiple possibilities. And in this case, it's what in the world of science is called a double-blind experiment, so to speak. That is to say, neither the bestower of the blessing nor the recipient of the blessing knew exactly what was happening. They never got to the seer of Lublin. The seer of Lublin perhaps took another path down to the chuppah. But it was the young Misharis, it was the young servant, it was the young personal assistant who nobody was paying much attention to because he was only, so to speak, only the assistant. And so nobody expected the blessing to come from him. And he didn't quite know what he was saying. He's a little bit annoyed that somebody's sitting on the ground and he says, would you please get up? And that was the word of blessing that needed to be heard. So be open to the blessing, but don't be fixated on who, what, where, when, and how. And then the blessing will come. Another aspect of this is an insight that I heard from my own daughter, Adina Oranama, Polen, Mays. She said as follows: the story is also about space, It's true, the Rupshitzer said, would you please get up? But before he does that, he's going like this. This is my plots from the Rebbe. Make room for the Rebbe. Blessing is often about making room, about seeing that there is space that you didn't see, that you're not necessarily in the Meitzar, you're not necessarily in the tight space, but you can come to a more expansive space, and that space will allow the blessing to flourish and to flower and to take root. I really love a Sephardic practice. I mean, I certainly am in the Ashkenazi tradition, but when I'm in a Sephardic synagogue, I hear a slight change in the Kaddish, where there's a string of requests, and then it says at the end, V'revach v'hatzalah. V'revach v'hatzalah. Now, it's not in the Ashkenazi version. And sometimes people in the congregation chime in as if that's the most important thing. We want healing, we want salvation, we want consolation, we want all these wonderful blessings. But at the end, the capstone is Revach v'hatzalah, openness, expansiveness, space. That is where the salvation will come. Actually, it's a quote from the book of Esther. I'm thinking of it right now. Revach v'hatzalah yamod la-Yehudim. It's about the openness of possibility that we did not see, that we did not perceive. And the idea of the blessing coming when we don't perceive it is very strong, even in the Birkat Kohanim. If you think about it, it's again a kind of another double blind where the kahal, the congregation, I just did it this morning, the kahal covers their face with a talit, and the Kohanim also cover their faces with a talit. So the bestower doesn't see the recipients don't see the bestower, meaning we're not fixated on any one particular idea or notion. We're not rigid about the blessing. That's the blessing of God. And that's the blessing of the story of the Rupshitzer saying, will you please get up? Right. Now the story of Rav Shmelka of Nickelsburg. So Rav Shmelka of Nickelsburg His dates are 1726 to 1778. He was a disciple of Reb Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, who died in 1772. The Maggid was the successor of the great Baal Shem Tov, who we talked about last session. In 1772, Rosh Shmuel, but he was called Rosh Shmelka of Nikolsburg. He became rabbi of this city, Nikolsburg in Moravia. So it was a large commercial city, a major center. The Empress Maria Theresa confirmed his appointment. And even though he was in a non-Hasidic center, he fought for the Hasidic movement that was being opposed at that time. He came to the defense of Hasidism when it was excommunicated in Vilna and Brody in 1782. He didn't act as a rebbe, he was a community rabbi, he was a great scholar himself. You could not be the community rabbi in a large city such as Nikolsburg if you were not a consummate Talmudic scholar and knew the Shulchan Aruch and Sheilot Teshuvot, response to literature backwards and forwards. So he was totally competent and a master of Jewish law, of halacha. But in addition, he did tinge his sermons with Hasidic teachings and thereby engendered a lot of opposition from the Misnagdim, from the opponents of the Hasidic movement. So here's where the story begins. There was a wealthy and prominent community leader who was never supportive of Rav Shmelka. In fact, he voted against his initial appointment, and he was always finding ways to trip up, perhaps to show that there was some problem with Rav Shmelka of Nikolsburg. It was looking for an opening, an opportunity to cause him to stumble. And he was not opposed to doing what we would call, in the world of politics, dirty tricks. The Yom Noraim were coming. It was the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of Teshuvah, when we're supposed to reconcile not only with God, but even more importantly with our fellow human being. And if we have any animosity or grudges, we're supposed to go to the person and we're supposed to try to make up with them. Rav Shmelka of Nikolsburg gets a message from this particular prominent community leader, from the wealthy man, and says, would you join me for the Suda Mafsekes? Would you join me for the meal before Yom Kippur? I realize that we have not been in the best of circumstances with each other. We don't see eye to eye, but it is right before Yom Kippur. Today is Erev Yom Kippur, where it's a mitzvah to eat, and it's also a mitzvah to come to peace with one another, to reconcile. Please join me at my table. Rav Shmelka was overjoyed that finally this person, who he had no way of reaching to his heart, was inviting him and reconciling. There was a place setting for Rav Shmelka, and they immediately began serving one course after another, Suda. There were 2 decanters of wine, one for the host and one for Rav Shmelka. And the servants began pouring wine into the cup of Rav Shmelka, and also from the other decanter into the cup of the host, the wealthy man. Unbeknownst to Rav Shmelka, in the other decanter there was grape juice. And in his decanter there was very, very strong and old wine. The community leader had thought up a strategy of getting Rav Shmelka drunk right before Kol Nidre, and Rav Shmelka would always give Kol Nidre drasha, a sermon, and he would lose himself and he would make a fool of himself, and finally, in the view of the wealthy man, this community would be rid of this person who was bringing the tainted teachings of Hasidism to Nikolsburg. So Rav Shmelka doesn't refuse the wine because he wants to show that he's on good terms with his host, and he does drink cup after cup of wine. The host realizes that his plan is succeeding, and now they walk to shul, kol nidre, just before Ma'ariv, it's time for the drasha. The wealthy man sits in his seat in the Mizrach font up front and is waiting for Rav Shmelka now to make a big fool of himself. However, what happens is Rav Shmelka, of course, is thinking about Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the day that is really a Yom V'Norah. It's the awesome day. It's the most awesome day of the year. And that sense of Emas Hadin, the awe, the Yira Shamayim, the fear of heaven, the Kedusha, the holiness, overwhelms him. And it has a physiological effect of encompassing and permeating his body so much that the alcohol that he had absorbed had no negative effect on his consciousness. The only thing that was affecting him was the Emas Hadin. And so he's perfectly focused, he's perfectly concentrated, and he gives his derasha. He talks about reconciliation, he talks about coming together, he talks about the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, he talks about the Avodah, he talks about the different services. He says 25 hours we're going to be in the Kodesh HaKodashim, we're going to be in the Holy of Holies. The tears flow from everyone's eyes. It's an amazing drasha. And the wealthy man is sitting in the seat and he can't believe what he's hearing. It's a beautiful drasha. There wasn't one misstep, there wasn't one false word. He says, well, maybe it takes a while for the alcohol to take effect. So they daven Ma'ariv, they say the poems. You know, there's this beautiful poem, Yalla Tachnoneinu Me'erev, Salachti, all the beautiful piyutim after the Amidah, and still nothing. So the wealthy man would normally go home after Aleinu, but he said, I'll stay longer. The pious practice in Nicholasburg, to this day, actually, in many parts of the world, in many synagogues, is that you stay after Marv. You don't have to, it's not mandatory, but many people stay, and you say Tillim. In Nicholasburg, the Tillim was led by Rav Shmelka. The Shmelka was a Chazan himself. Again, I think we've touched on this already, that in the Hasidic movement, Niggun and music is so central, is so important. And sometimes they would have an appointed Chazan, a prayer leader, but for the most sacred services, the Rav himself, the Rebbe himself, the Tzaddik himself, would often lead the services. In this case, the Kol Nidre and the Ne'ilah were led by Rav Shmelka, and Rav Shmelka led the chanting of the Tehillim, the chanting of the Psalms, after the main service was over. So I don't know how many people stayed. Let's say 30% of the people were still there, men and women, and the wealthy man would normally go home, but he decided to stay to see if the alcohol would kick in. Rav Shmelka gets up, and he begins with the first pasuk. Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach ba'atzas reshayim uvederech hatayim lo yomad uv'moishav le'etzim lo yashav ki im b'soiras Hashem cheftzai uv'soiras ha'yegeh yaimam v'loilam. And after each verse, the congregation would repeat after him. So it was a responsive reading, and they don't rush through. And this is key to Hasidic davening. If the words are worth saying, they're worth saying with total focus, they're worth saying with presence, they're worth saying not only with joy, but with sweetness, with ne'imus, yedidus, arevus, mesikus. So it takes a long time. In fact, it was almost until dawn in many years when they finished the entire book of Tehillim. They would say the entire book of Tehillim. Of course, you could leave whenever you needed to. But Rav Shmelka would stay there all night, and those who wanted to would stay. In this story, the wealthy man is losing his patience, but he still stays. And they finally come to the end of book 1. You know, there are 5 books of the Tehillim. And the end of book 1 is Psalm 41. And the penultimate verse is almost at the very end. It says, Bezos yodati. I think you see it on your screen. Bezos yodati ki chafatzta bi, ki lo yaria oivi aloi. So Rav Shmelka of Nickelsburg chants this verse. Bezos yodati ki chafatzta bi, ki lo yaria oivi aloi. Now the simple meaning of the verse is, then shall I know that you are pleased with me when my enemy cannot shout in triumph over me. Ki lo yaria oivi aloi. That is to say, David, as you know, had enemies throughout his life. In particular, King Saul, who realized that he was a rival for the throne and wanted to kill him. In any event, this could be any time, any place, any person. So it's a request to God on the level of pshat, on the plain sense of the verse. God, if you like me, if you love me, if you're pleased with me, don't allow my enemy to shout with glee and triumph over me. Ki lo yaria, like teruah of the shofar. Ki lo yaria oivi aloi, that my enemy not shout triumphantly over me. However, Rav Shmelka paused and he began repeating the verse, which he didn't do with any of the other verses until then. He said each verse sweetly and slowly and carefully, but he didn't repeat. And this verse he kept repeating, Bezos yodati ki chafatzta bi, ki lo yaria oivi aloi. And then he began translating into Yiddish in a way that was a free and Hasidic reframing of the meaning of the verse. And he says, it's in Yiddish, but I will say it in English. God, if you like me, if you do what I would want to happen, bezos yodati ki chafatzta bi, ki lo yaria oivi alai, ki lo yaria, as if the word was from roa, as if my enemy not suffer ill effects on my account, as if my enemy not be harmed spiritually or metaphysically because of what he tried to do to me. And the Kahal is looking in puzzlement, like, why is the Rebbe repeating this? Why is he sort of sticking with this particular verse? And why is he translating it in Yiddish? And why is he giving a translation that most people realize was not the simple meaning of the verse? And he repeats it again and again and again. God, please don't allow my enemy to suffer ill harm, no harm come to him on my account, ki lo yaria oivi alai. And suddenly the wealthy man realizes that the Rebbe, Rav Shmelka of Nickelsburg, is praying for him. That he had perpetrated this terrible sin. He had tricked the rabbi into coming. He had tricked the rabbi into drinking much more wine than a person normally should, certainly before Yom Kippur, especially if you're giving the big drasha of the year, and hoping to make a fool of the rabbi, and using the pretext of reconciliation for this plot. Now, you know that the Mishnah says that Yom Kippur will always affect atonement. with some very, very few exceptions. If it's ben adam l'chavero, if it's an interpersonal flaw, then God alone will not do it, the day will not do it. You have to reconcile with the person. And furthermore, if you misuse the mechanism, echta v'yom kippurim mechaper, then ein Yom Kippurim mechaper. This person misused the mechanism of Yom Kippur itself. Under the guise of reconciliation, he sought to undermine the position of the rabbi. He has compromised the repair mechanism. So, and yet even here, the Rebbe, Rav Shmelka, found a way to reframe the situation by his Hasidic interpretation of the verse, where you relate to the verse in a very personal way. Of course, Rav Shmelka knew the pshat, right? Some people said the Hasidim didn't know how to read scripture. That's not true at all. It was a fluid, it was a dynamic, it was a intimate framing of scripture for the purpose of channeling forgiveness, for the purpose of channeling benevolence. It was a rereading of the biblical verse as a prayer to intercede in heaven for this person who had committed the most heinous crime on Erev Yom Kippur and on Yom Kippur itself, and this finally entered into the consciousness of the rich man, and he realized what he had done, and he realized that Rav Shmelka was praying for him. He began to weep uncontrollably. He ran up to the bimah. He gave a big hug to Rav Shmelka, and the story concludes that he became the best friend of Rav Shmelka of Nikolsburg and his greatest communal supporter for the rest of his life. Hiskashrus. There's a story which does not appear in any written source that I have seen. And I heard it orally from one of my teachers, the late Professor Elie Wiesel. I studied with him in Boston. It was a great privilege to be with him. I heard it orally once in a class maybe 40 years ago. I don't think he ever wrote it up, but I wrote an appreciation of him at a celebration at the university, and this now appears in my notes. A chassid of the Rizhiner Rebbe, in order to expand what was already a moderately successful enterprise, needed to make a business trip to Paris. Now, a chassid never leaves without getting first permission from his Rebbe and getting his Rebbe's blessing. But in this case, the chassid was quite hesitant to do so because everybody knew that Paris had a, shall we say, a reputation as a center of impious behavior. And the chassid was afraid that the Rebbe would not allow the chassid to go. But you can't leave without getting permission and getting a blessing, getting a bracha from the Rebbe, so he goes. To his surprise, the Rebbe said, fine, no problem. Your trip will be crowned with success. You'll have no problems whatsoever, either financially or spiritually. And just as the chassid is about to leave the room of the Rebbe says to the, by the way, you know I like to smoke a pipe. It's true, the Rizhiner Rebbe smoked a pipe. Said, when you're in Paris, I'm sure they have a selection of pipes that you don't have nearby here. Do me a favor, pick up a nice pipe, and I will pay you when you get back. The chassid said, no, Rebbe, please, it's going to be my gift. It may be my highest honor. I want to get a pipe for the Rebbe. The chassid travels to Paris. He's busy from day to night talking with people, with contacts, inventory, new selections, furs and styles. It's all about business from morning to night. He does find a Hasidic shtibel in Paris, and thank God he doesn't have any temptations. He doesn't go to opera. He doesn't go to any place he's not supposed to go. He's totally busy. He gets back to Rizhin. It's been a very successful visit. Just as he approaches the outskirts of Rizhin, he realizes, oh, Rabbeinu Shalom, vergessen, I forgot all about the pipe. I can't come back to the Rebbe without the pipe. He turns the carriage around and he says, go to the nearest large city that has a pipe, that has a smoke shop, that has a store that sells pipes. They go back. Maybe they travel an hour back to one of the larger cities. They find a smoke shop that's open. They get a pipe. Come back again to Rishon. And the chassid goes, of course, when you come back, the first thing, even before going home, you meet your Rebbe and says, Rebbe, everything the Rebbe said was totally true. I had a very successful visit. I found a place to daven. Everything was good. I did everything a chassid should do. I didn't do anything a chassid shouldn't do. And with the blessing of the Rebbe, I had a tzlacha. Oh, and by the way, here's a pipe. He didn't say he got it in Paris. The Rishon Rebbe looks at him and says, let's call him Yankel. Says, Yankel, have a seat. Once the Rebbe says have a seat, then you know you have something coming at you. Says, I have two questions for you, or I have a question for you. First of all, don't you think I know where you got the pipe? Of course, in Hasidic world, the Rebbe has clairvoyance. He doesn't say that, but he says, don't you think I know where you got the pipe? But the bigger question is, do you think I really needed a pipe? I didn't need a pipe. What I wanted was, when you would be in Paris, I wanted you to remember that you had a Rebbe in Rishon. That was the whole purpose. In other words, it's all about hiskashrus. It's all about bonding. It's all about being together. The stories, in my view, are never about the clairvoyance. They're all about the wisdom that comes from the Rebbe. One last story. It will be next session that we will be talking about Hasidic Niggun. I'm going to end with one, for me, powerful story. A Rebbe comes into the Beis Medrash, the Hasidim are sitting there, and says, here's a scenario. You're walking down the street, you go to the marketplace. There's somebody walking in front of you. You see something's dangling out of his pocket. A slip of paper or something flutters out of his pocket. You look down and you see, oh my, Rabbeinu Shalom, it's 1,000 ruble Russian imperial bank note. What would you do? What would you do? The Hasidim are looking around. They're so flustered. They don't know what to say. Finally, one of the Hasidim raises his hand and says, Rebbe, it's a mitzvah, Shavas Aveda. I would return it. And the Rebbe looks at him and says, Il zant a nar. You're a fool. Very surprising answer. The Rebbe asks again, you're walking into the marketplace. Something flutters out of a pocket. You look, it's 1,000 ruble. What would you do? What would you do? Well, hearing the first answer, another chassid raises his hand and says, Rebbe, I guess maybe I would keep it. The Rebbe says, Izant a ganef. You're a thief. So now the Hasidim are totally stymied. They've heard two oppositional answers. The obvious answer, give it back, it's a mitzvah. And the Rebbe sort of waved that off. The other answer, keep it, the Rebbe waves it off. And the Rebbe asks again, you're walking in the street, 1,000 rubles falls down. You look at it, what would you do? What would you do? Give me an answer. Finally, the youngest person in the room, a little chassid, 14 years old, raises his hands. And the only one who dares to speak and says, Rebbe, I don't know what I would do. But I pray to God that if that ever happened, I pray that I would be given the wisdom and the courage and the conviction to do the right thing. And the Rebbe said, that's the answer I was waiting for. We never know what we would do in a situation. We can only pray for the wisdom and the courage and the conviction to do the right thing. Thank you very much. I look forward to our next session, Hasidic Niggun.